the YWCA of Greater Los Angeles. Welcome to our town hall, Standing in Solidarity. On behalf of our board and all of the staff, we're so proud to be here today to talk about our mission, the elimination of racism wherever it exists and by any means necessary. You know, it's the unrest that have unfolded these past few weeks. They underline the precarious state of race. This country has gone on far too long with this standing legacy of structural racism and just entrenched inequities that it just can no longer be dismissed. Often we brush it away with eloquent prose or speeches, and we think that that's going to do it. Well, the worldwide demonstrations brought on by Black Lives Matters that just amplified the voices of all of those who can't speak for themselves. Well, I'm here to tell you that the YWCA heard you. We looked at our mission and we said, you know, we marveled at the moments of protests, but we've now got folks who are just, in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, they're sick and tired of being sick and tired. Mm-hmm. We are now in a space. It requires deliberate thought and action. We have tried to write this script so many times, and yet it always plays itself out in a different key. Well, I think we might have the right key this time. We have assembled a diversity of folks in this town hall that demonstrates the sincerity of our conversation. In a word, I think that we got people here and folks in this place that mean business. We want to stand in solidarity with you, because if we do, I am so confident, just extremely confident, that we will advance the dream. This dream is going to start with a delight of mine, because I get to introduce this amazing young woman who has agreed to serve as our moderator today. She's none other than the award-winning anchor woman for CBS2 News, Pat Harvey. Pat, thank you so much for agreeing to do this for us. It is a thought that has come out, and we know it's going to work because we're standing in solidarity and we have the voices of those present that will resonate in the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pat Harvey to the program.
Well, thank you so much, Faye. And you know I love you for life by calling me a young lady, considering I've been in LA alone for 30 years and have witnessed so much of the change that you, the YWCA Greater Los Angeles, and my dear friend, of course, Cynthia Hurd. I've seen so many things that you have done to uplift the community, to try to uplift girls and women in particular. And just to see that we are back here in a place that I didn't think that we would see again, actually, in our lifetimes. And I want to be mindful of the fact that George Floyd, it was a month ago yesterday that he lost his life. As you say, we are here to convene this incredible virtual town hall meeting with some very important and expert voices as we continue to respond to the civil unrest of 2020 and peaceful protest that's going on across our nation, and it continues to do so. Want to again mention the fantastic work on the part of the YWCA Greater Los Angeles. If you are able to do so, please donate. Yes, they can't continue unless we help them. Donate by texting YWCA GLA 2020 to 1-855-663-9922. To all of our virtual listeners and viewers out there, we want to welcome you this morning. We're going to explore a conversation of social injustice, equality, racism, reform, and of course, what comes next after the protest. Where do we go from here? George Floyd is the latest of many Black, brown, and indigenous men and women who have lost their lives, who have been killed by a police officer. Racial injustice in our country is now in plain view, but of course, it's not new or shocking. In the peak of COVID-19, Americans of color are dying at disproportionate rates, and we must respond to change across the board. I'd like to welcome our first guest this morning. We have heard from her throughout the weeks of our protests here in Los Angeles. Her name is Nury Martinez. She became the first Latina city council president in the city council's 170-year history. President Nury Martinez is on the front lines. She has been for many, many years, but especially now is playing an integral role in what we're trying to accomplish in the city. Welcome, Madam President.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Nice to see everyone. Thank you for having me.
Well, our first question to you, Madam President, you and your colleagues proposed reducing the LAPD budget by $150 million, a cut of up to 8%, in fact, in the coming fiscal year. Mayor Garcetti agreed to redirect $250 million from the police department and other city programs to pay for jobs for youths and health initiatives and peace centers to heal trauma in the Black community and communities of color. So I want to ask you, some say it's time to rethink public safety in Los Angeles. Do you agree with that? And if so, what does that look like?
Absolutely. And thank you again for having me. You know, this word about reimagining or redirecting services to Black and Brown communities is nothing new to some of us, right? We've been doing this work our entire life. When I took over the city council to become council president in January, I laid out a Families First agenda to talk about the working poor and Black and Brown communities in Los Angeles. So my entire career has been focused on redirecting services to disenfranchised communities. So this is anything new. It's nothing new to us. But I think it's important to state that law enforcement is so much more than suppression. So much of it has to do with investing in communities early. It also has to do with ensuring that we level the playing field for our children. So many times we think about law enforcement when a crime is committed, but we never think about the tools and the resources that are needed to prevent crime from happening in some of these communities to begin with. And so when I talk about reimagining public safety, I'm asking the officers to join in on what we want public safety to look like, particularly in Black and Brown communities. So many of our officers are dealing with issues and calls that they shouldn't have to. They're not trained professional nurses. They're not trained professional mental health experts. That's not what they were trained to do. And so it's about time that we get serious about how we deal with mental health issues and addiction issues in our communities and hire the teams that are going to be able to help people as opposed to calling law enforcement to step in and deal with these social issues. The other thing I want to mention is reimagining public safety also means investing in our parks, investing in our libraries, investing in things that perhaps affluent communities in other parts of Los Angeles take for granted. Our children cannot pay for professional sports teams. We can't pay that coach to teach our kids a particular sport. We depend on these types of resources in our neighborhoods for our kids to have a fighting chance. So it's more than just reimagining public safety. It's about getting serious over the decades about communities that we have forgotten about. It's getting serious about investing in them, investing in children, investing in poor people. That's what it has to do with. And I think now more than ever, we have to take a look at ourselves and really ask our questions. Why haven't we done that? Why have these communities historically been forgotten?
You know, Madam President, in terms of everything that you just addressed, it's going to take the cooperation, obviously, on the part of the police union. How do you think you're going to be able to manage that? Being a member of the city council, you will have direct negotiation. I see Carl smiling. We're going to get to Carl in a minute, but how is that going to be effective? Because everything that I've heard is this is all well and good, but you have to be able to make sure that the unions, you know, release some of the stronghold that they have on the police department and listening to the demands of what you just suggested. Mm-hmm. Is that feasible?
Well, that's a good question. I think the time is calling upon them to look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves, are they reflective of the population in Los Angeles? Are they talking to the rank and file, and almost 50% of police officers are Latinos. And so to me, the question is, when are we going to talk about the fact that, they also need to figure out how to diversify their own board of directors to be more reflective of the rank and file. But to get to your question, I think it's something that we have got to continue to ask them to meet us halfway, if not meet us at the table and debate some of these issues. No police officer that I know of in my community, particularly the ones that I grew up with, want to deal with these types of calls that puts them in danger as well. And so when I talk to rank and file in my district, I talk to men and women who look just like me, who grew up with the same issues that we're grappling with right now. I'm asking them to step up and ask their union to be better, to ask their union to step up and meet us halfway about what it means to reimagine public safety in these communities. And I think there is a will to do that, but I think it's also realistic to understand that no one wants to give up any power. Power is something that isn't easy to give up, and I'm not asking them to do that. What I'm asking them to do is to listen to the millions of people who've taken to the streets to demand change when it comes to reimagining public safety. I don't think that's too much to ask.
All right, we're going to ask you to stand by for a moment, Madam President. We're going to bring in another panelist, Assemblywoman Sydney Kamlager. She represents the 54th Assembly District, and in 2019, she guided 6 of her 8 bills to the governor's desk, all of which were signed into law. Most notable among them were Assembly Bills 241 and 242 that incorporates implicit bias training into continued education for healthcare professionals, lawyers, and judges, respectively. Assemblywoman, a lot of people are saying that should be incorporated into policing. And of course, some of the police spokespeople will say, well, we already do that. Do you have a response to that answer? We already have bias training, and if so, should there be more, or should it look different than what it does now?
Right. Well, I want to thank you for the question. I first want to say good morning. It is good to be here. It is always good to be considered by the leaders of the YWCA. I always tip my hat off to Faye Washington and her fearless leadership, and the women who work with her to make all of this happen. Yes, last year I carried a package of bills, AB 241, AB 242, and AB 243 were my implicit bias bills. 241 dealt with the medical community. 242 dealt with judges, those that work within the courts. And 243 dealt with law enforcement. But if you will recall, last year was also the year that we passed AB 392, landmark legislation that talked about unreasonable and unnecessary force. And so part of the negotiations asked that 243 got tabled. Law enforcement will say they do bias training. I don't know how thorough their implicit bias training is, and I think it's important to note that we all come to the table, we all wake up every single day with implicit biases. But when you are dealing with sectors or with decision makers who are making decisions about your life, like doctors, like nurses, like physician assistants, like judges, like folks in law enforcement, I believe that it is important that on the regular, you are participating in activities that are thoughtful, that are meaningful, and that help you acknowledge so that you can check your biases. We have seen from our data on sentencing that this is pernicious with the bench. Because Black men disproportionately get longer sentences than white men. They are disproportionately given more time on probation, more time on parole. 50% of those that are on death row or are serving life without parole are Black men. So we see it in the courts. But there needs to be more done, quite frankly, and we shouldn't just stop the ball with having conversations about implicit bias in law enforcement. We need to talk about recruitment. We need to talk about training. We need to talk about the culture and the behavior within the different departments. We need to talk about how they were designed, how they were founded. We need to talk about the history of their chiefs and the kind of culture and behavior that they allowed to have happen, because those are systemic threads of injustice that permeate our communities. I think it's also important to acknowledge that while we are talking about law enforcement, let's not just stop there. There are prosecutors, police, and judges that also have a say in someone's life and how successful, how safe, and how liberated that person's life will be. And those three decision makers, police, judges, and prosecutors, extends into our relationship with jails, with prisons, with probation, and parole. And all of those exercise some form of apartheid when you're talking about your ability to succeed, to get housing, to get employment, to be out of a gang database or out of a database, to be under monitored and under surveilled, under prosecuted, arrested as equal, to any other race, but certainly not more than. So we have a much deeper series of thoughtful discussions that we have to have if we're going to talk about unpacking injustice.
All right, Assemblywoman, thank you very, very much. Now I have to move on to our distinguished panelist who is working so very hard for all of us. She just slipped in here to be part of this panel because she is in Washington. And I'm going to have to do your bio, Congresswoman Bass. I know you probably don't want a long introduction, but I've got to tell you quite a bit about Karen Bass. She, of course, is a 5-term Congresswoman in the 37th District. She chairs the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, the Judiciary Committee on Crime. Congressmember Bass introduced the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which passed, by the way, the House last night by 3 votes. So congratulations to you on that. She also worked with Senators Cory Booker, Kamala Harris on a companion bill in the Senate. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act bans chokeholds and no-knock warrants. It creates a national database of police misconduct and sets national training standards and accreditation for police officers, among other provisions. Congressmember Bass also serves as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. And on a personal note, I want to throw in that she has been a longtime champion for racial and social justice. She founded the Community Coalition back here in 1990 in Los Angeles. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Well,
go ahead.
Thank you very much as well. And it's wonderful to see all my friends, and most especially the great Faye Washington, who is one of the best leaders in our community, and the lives that she has saved of the young people really is a tribute to her. So it's wonderful to see you all. And I'm sorry that I'm ripping and running. We actually are in the middle of a vote right now, but I wanted to come in here and share a few words and then go back out there. But yes, we did celebrate yesterday getting the bill out of the House. And I'll tell you that we had the entire Democratic caucus, which is over 230 people that voted. And we were able to get 3 Republicans at the last minute, which was shocking considering that Trump tweeted a couple of days ago. And usually when he tweets, they are in lockstep with whatever he says. So the fact that they jumped ship is really significant. And then the other thing is that after the vote was over, my Republican colleagues were all coming up to me one after the other talking about how they wanted to get something done. And I think we all need to recognize the significance of that, because I think that George Floyd's murder was so grotesque and it lasted so long and everybody watched it, and the guy was just looking at the camera with complete impunity, that it's caused a seismic shift. And we know that it wasn't just his murder, but it's the work of folks on this call who have been working for years. And I see the good doctor there, Dr. Abdullah, and the work that has happened over all of these years, the level of consciousness that has been raised now. And I think that this has really been a catalyst. My Republican colleagues, listen, some of my Democratic colleagues, okay, wouldn't have been talking like this a few years ago, because every time there was a video, people would say, well, I don't really know what happened before the video, and what did this person do to deserve it, and all of that kind of stuff went on. and it didn't happen this time. So a couple of other features in the bill that I want to mention is that we lower the standard for prosecution. I know our great attorney, Carl Douglas, will like this. Instead of willful intent, lowering it to recklessness, and also the qualified immunity. I do have to admit the qualified immunity seems to be the most controversial part of the bill. And so I think that is really important. The ability to fire, prosecute, and sue is really important. And then the database. I mean, yesterday was Tamir Rice's birthday. And so we dedicated the vote to Tamir Rice, who would have been 18, 12-year-old shot by a police officer that had been fired. And through meeting with the Fraternal Order of Police and also the Association of Police Chiefs, that it's a very common thing. I don't know that it's common in our city, but throughout the country, it's very common for officers to be, well, it's not that common for them to be fired, but when they are fired, they just go down the street to another department. And so having the database that would be publicly visible, I think, is important. Now, the Senate voted against the Tim Scott bill. The Tim Scott bill mimicked our bill, but it had no teeth, no enforcement in it. So, for example, we're not going to ban chokeholds. We're going to study them. No knock. We're going to compile data about no knock. And this is not the time. This is a moral moment here, and we have to grab it. I'm very concerned about the sense of time. We have to get this done quickly. We are one hurricane away from all of this being wiped off the screen. Because in America, our attention span is so short that I'm worried that if we don't get this done quickly. So it passed out of the House, failed in the Senate. Harris Booker, their bill mirrors ours, but now is the time that we have to start negotiating. And so that's what will take place now. The Republicans that came up and talked to me that want to continue conversations, Tim Scott and I came in together. So I know him, and we'll be having conversations. So we're going to see what it is that we can get done. Nury, you're doing such a great job. I mean, I'm so excited about the first Latina president of the city council. That's a real big deal. And I know you're managing multiple crises at the same time. So my hat's off to you, and congratulations, Capri. I do want to say a word to Jorja Leap, because you need to know that I don't know you, but one of your former students works with me. He's right here. And he was telling me about the class he took with you, that you had him read Brian Stevenson's book. And you should know that he's my communications director, been with me for years. So if you see me in social media, I don't know how to do any of that.
Well, Congresswoman, before you go off, you've been involved, as I mentioned, the Community Coalition back in 1990. You have seen the changes back and forth with different police chiefs, different directives on the part of LAPD. You remember when community policing was introduced, they talk about the body cameras. On their view, they would say, well, we've made some big changes in how we do policing. Do you worry about tying the hands of police in terms of the legislation that we want passed?
Well, when I went to George Floyd's service in Houston, and I looked up at his portrait, and I saw he was born in 1973. In 1973, I was in the Coalition Against Police Abuse. 47 years. So some things have changed, sure, but other things have not, and have gone in the opposite direction. And that's why I think the movement that is calling for re-envisioning policing, Community Coalition was started in 1990 to address what we knew was going to lead to mass incarceration. The other thing that we were addressing at the time, we used different language. Avis, you'll remember this, devolution was the word that we used, when all that meant was the federal government was divesting from cities. So while we were trying to fight the legislation that was going to lead to mass incarceration, we were also trying to fight the divestment that was happening in cities as well. And the idea that we pulled money away from social services and chose to invest in policing, that's something that hasn't fundamentally, that's gone in the exact opposite direction. Legal services used to be provided. So I didn't have to call up Justin and say, hey, there's somebody, could you please help a sister out? because we had legal services, we had legal aid, we had resources. Again, never enough, but at least we had some. And so in some ways, I think it's gone in the opposite direction. In other ways, I mean, we don't have Daryl Gates anymore. I mean, Daryl Gates, and we can fire the police chief. We couldn't even do that before. You remember that? I mean,
Yes,
we were fighting Daryl Gates in 1973. He didn't get fired until 1993. I think it was 93. That was 20 years.
After the 92, right.
73. He
When
was
they
more
used real bullets, by the way.
Exactly. He was more powerful than the mayor. And he kept files on all of us, harassed us. We had to sue him. I mean, and he's the one that said chokeholds, you know, we have bad neck veins. That's what our problem was. So sure, some things that have changed structurally, some things have gone in the opposite direction. So I think what's wonderful about what's happening now is all these questions are put on the table. And I think that's a really good thing. Another piece of the bill provides grants to community-based organizations to re-envision policing.
All right, well, Congresswoman, a lot of people are paying attention now more than ever before. We want to thank you for joining us, and we know you've got to get back to some important work, and I'm going to be talking to you a little later.
Oh, yeah, that's right. See you later.
All right, so we'll see you then. And we've been talking about how people have been or beginning to be involved more than they ever have been at this particular time, and there is a reason for that. A big sweeping movement happened across not only the city, the country, but the world. Let's take a look. Well, this next panelist really needs no introduction. She was appointed to the Los Angeles County Human Relations Commission in 2014. She is a recognized expert on race, gender, class, and social movements. She was among the original group of organizers that convened to form Black Lives Matter, and she continues to serve as a Los Angeles chapter lead and contributes to the national leadership. Welcome this morning, Dr. Melina Abdullah. You are probably one of the busiest people here besides Karen Bass today, and I say that simply because of the movement that has been created. You've helped to build Black Lives Matter from a hashtag to a global movement, not just a local movement. And I want to ask you first, is this movement different than any of the previous civil rights movements that we've seen in our generation, and how?
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm thankful to the YWCA for convening this town hall. I think it's important to recognize that every movement builds upon the work of the previous. And so, of course, Black Lives Matter is different than the Black Power movement, is different than the Civil Rights movement, but it takes lessons from it. And there are people who were active in both of those movements who remain active in Black Lives Matter. And so I think some of the lessons that we learned are to center women. And I think that the role that women played in birthing Black Lives Matter and continue to play in leading Black Lives Matter is essential, and it translates into the way that we do our work. So for instance, there's no more mothering at home and organizing in public. There's, the recognition that we're all of who we are at the same time, and the movement and the work that we do has to accommodate that and actually benefits from that. And so I think there's differences, but also there's continuities. There's also the piece about being very clear about rejecting respectability politics. We know that the systems that oppress us cannot be the same systems that liberate us. And so, sometimes we cuss a little, right? Sometimes we say we have to do more than vote. We always say we have to do more than vote. Sometimes there's disruptions, and my attorney is on the town hall. And so we're grateful for the ways in which everyone plugs into this work. Were it not for Carl Douglas, many of us would be in jail or prison right now. And so recognizing that some of us have to put our bodies and our freedom on the line is something that we've embraced as well, which is a continuity as well as a kind of newfound space of organizing.
Are you surprised yourself though, Dr. Melina, at the kind of response that you have received? And I know you say people from previous civil rights movements have been involved this time, but this is just people all over the world, different stripes, different colors, genders, ages. Were you a bit surprised that you were able to pull all of these people in? And why do you think that's happened?
Well, I think that we've been very clear from the beginning of Black Lives Matter, and we birthed Black Lives Matter 7 years ago. July 13th, 2013 was the day that George Zimmerman was acquitted in the murder of Trayvon Martin. And I think that we were very clear from that moment that we need to be a Black-led and ally-supported organization, that it is the responsibility of everyone, especially white people, to dismantle white supremacy. And so we're seeing that kind of take shape. We have ally organizations like White People for Black Lives. We work very closely with indigenous groups like AIM SoCal. We partner with organizations like Centro CSO, where actually one of the co-founders of the Brown Berets, Carlos Montes, continues to work in Centro CSO. And so we fully embrace kind of the title for this town hall today, that we have to stand in solidarity.
You know, people also have the question, which you hear so much, so I'm going to let you answer it today. What do you mean by defunding the police?
I'm so glad you asked that. So for many years, there have been attempts to reform a system of policing that was intentionally and deliberately created to produce the outcomes that it does. So if we think about the work of in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, there was this conversation around police reform. Let me be very clear about where we stand as Black Lives Matter and where I stand and what I know as a scholar of Black studies, that policing descends from slave catching, point blank, period. There is no debate about that, right? So as ridiculous as it would sound to say, let's reform chattel slavery, that's the same ridiculousness of reforming a system of policing that is a vestige of chattel slavery. And so we're very clear, we have to defund the police. We are not interested. I know there's been conversation about diversity and implicit bias training. Every study demonstrates that implicit bias training does not fundamentally change behaviors, that the only things that change the behaviors of police are holding them accountable, meaning that they are prosecuted when they behave criminally. When they kill our people, they must be prosecuted. And unfortunately, in Los Angeles County, we have a district attorney who refuses to prosecute police. And most district attorneys refuse to prosecute police who murder our people. We have 609 deaths at the hands of law enforcement since Jackie Lacey took office. And not a single officer has been prosecuted so far, although charges have been filed in just one case. And so it's really important that we think about that. But the second thing is, the thing that preserves Black life the most is distance from police. Less interaction with police is what preserves Black life. And so when we live in a city where 54% of the city's general fund is allocated to police, you are putting Black lives at risk. And so we say defund the police and invest in the things that actually make communities safe. That reimagining of public safety is something that we've been talking about since our beginning, that safety comes when the universal needs of people are met, when we have things like parks and libraries, and when we invest in transformational justice practices rather than policing.
All right. Well, Dr. Abdullah, I think you explained your position quite succinctly here today. And thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for having me. And we hope people will follow our work at blmla.org, and the budget question, the defunding of police question, at peoplesbudgetla.com.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Melina. Now, our next panelist is Avis Ridley Thomas. She is a friend and, of course, has been in the city of Los Angeles, the forefront for many, many years. She founded Los Angeles City Attorney's Dispute Resolution Program in 1989, and she's also the co-director of the Institute for Nonviolence in Los Angeles Days of Dialogue. And we do have a video, Avis, that we'd like to share with our virtual town hall members today.
Police officer has been shot in Watts.
Here we go again. African-American shot by a police officer. He was unarmed. He's dead.
We losing loved ones every day to the people that's sworn in to protect us.
Everyone right now focus on words and actions that can unite this country rather than divide it further.
Baker. Madison. Here. Desmore. Here. Nathan. Sir. Lopes. Sir. Jules. Here. Ian.
Days of Dialogue on the Future of Policing is the current series that we're focusing on. LAPD Command and sheriffs came to the executive director of Days of Dialogue and said, clearly, we need to have dialogue about the future of policing.
A lot of people are interested in the dialogue process as a result of the frustration that they feel about events, current events going on.
Here we are at the table discussing issues of consequence in terms of law enforcement.
At every Days of Dialogue session, the makeup dialogue table will be specifically 1 or 2 trained volunteer facilitators.
I'm wondering if we could have some discussion around what we'd like to see in training.
1 or 2 police officers.
And they can't look at you as a regular person. They look at you as like, this guy's the law, he's trying to take away my freedom.
And then 6, 8, 10 community members.
This is not the 1940s. This is 2016. This is 2016. The vast majority of our police officers need to be college educated, not barely high school dropouts.
People come in to these sessions and they're very angry. They're physically angry.
So I'm not dancing around. Yeah, they're great people, I'm
but
sure.
The system is white supremacist.
And I'm sorry, as people, as a whole class of people, you don't address the issues that cause it.
If you can't disarm an old lady with a screwdriver, you don't need to be wearing anybody's uniform.
I don't care if you don't like what I say, but don't abuse me.
Because since I was growing up in the 90s, there's been an issue with the department. And I don't know how to get rid of that.
Police officers can be honest about what their experiences and thoughts are and the challenges that they face.
Why are young African-American males, why do they feel like they need to have a gun on them walking in their own neighborhood, right?
They have to leave work at work and home at home, and sometimes that's hard to do when they're one and the same.
You know, sometimes it does get to us emotionally where like we take it out on people, but it's not intentional, and that's what we have to learn and kind of, again, check ourselves.
The people who come in the angriest then, who are able to sit at the table and have this conversation, by the end of the dialogue, their anger is diffused. And it's almost magical, the transformation that has occurred.
I have seen the community grateful of people listening to their concerns.
For me, it was very eye-opening to hear about someone who was present during the Watts riots.
We want to have your back. And a surefire way to get that is that you self-police.
There were hard questions, but I think they needed to be asked.
The problem wasn't created overnight. It's not going to be solved overnight.
These guys are in uniforms right now, but they have families. They're human beings, and I'm a human being, and there's something that unites all of us.
Video. And amid a rise in gun violence and hate crimes in traumatized communities across the nation, the Institute for Nonviolence convened more than 100 civic, business, community, and religious leaders for that Days of Dialogue session around the theme of reclaiming civility and tolerance in the face of violence. You've seen so much, Avis. Can you tell us why the Days of Dialogue is so important in a time like this?
Well, it is so clear as everyone has experienced all these recent traumas, and of course the long-term intransigent issues related to racism and sexism and a variety of ways that people have been marginalized. Dialogue is what everyone is calling for. You hear them say it as they're discussing what is happening today. It is necessary for us at some point to simply be prepared to negotiate directly with those folks with whom we are having problems and issues, to come to a civil way of following through on whatever issue we consider important. So dialogue is critical. Our latest is Days of Dialogue, Racism, Policing the Pandemic and Beyond. And so we will be calling on members of our community to participate in that effort as well.
What do you expect to come from that, Avis? Do you think that at this time that there would be more of an opportunity to have the dialogues really make a meaningful impact? And I say that only because when we think of the unrest from 92, we had meetings and people talked to one another, but this time seems to be very, very different. And I can't say this enough that it appears that more people are listening. Do you see more optimism at this time?
I see optimism, and especially we've actually done a beta test, actually 2, on the most recent dialogue subject. And people come out of that. We do pre and post testing with far more hope than when they enter the virtual rooms for the dialogue process. So it is very, very important. And you heard Congresswoman Bass, you heard President Martinez talk about how we need to sit down and negotiate about budgets and policies. Things that require change need the opportunity to be fleshed out for our own understanding. So our focus is really deliberation. There are many, many ways that people can be engaged and involved, but once they are out there and they are protesting and they are, bringing attention to an issue, the hard work is what happens afterward. And so the dialogue is just the very first step. That's all that we provide. We saw that as a missing piece when we started Days of Dialogue in 1995 after the Million Man March and the O.J. Simpson criminal trial. And so we are still seeing that need today. I've been actually retired from my former position in the city attorney's office now for nearly a decade. And yet when an issue emerges in our community, I get the calls, as I did this time, for people who want the dialogue now. And so we are still working to provide that service with now about 1,000 community mediators who trained over the years. So, they stood up in 1992. Some of the same institutions are approaching us now to access our services. So we are delighted to provide it. We know how essential it is. We see the benefit of it, and we are just delighted to be able to provide the service in Los Angeles.
Well, we thank you. We know from action, you have to have dialogue first to lay the groundwork. Thank you so much, Avis Ridley Thomas. Now, our next panelist is Kristen Clarke. She leads one of the country's most important national civil rights organizations in the pursuit of equal justice for all. She joins us now, and Kristen, thanks for being here. Can you tell us more about your organization?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this convening and creating this space for us to talk about
share strategies, and really reflect on the hard work that we need to do to deal with this very unique moment that we're in. It's just an honor and privilege to be here with you. So I lead a national civil rights organization called the Lawyers Committee of Civil Rights Under Law. This year actually marks our 57th birthday. We were founded in June of 1963 in the heyday of the civil rights movement. Days after the tragic killing of Medgar Evers, President John F. Kennedy felt that there was an urgent need to bring lawyers together from across the country to really talk about what was happening in the country at that time and what role could the private bar play in coming to the aid of victims of discrimination. About 200 lawyers convened with him at that meeting, and many of them heeded the charge. They went back home and they started to protect the rights of protesters, protect the rights of people engaged in sit-ins. And here we are in 2020, and we're still doing the same work, right? Civil rights lawyers are still out here on the front lines dealing with the tragic killings of unarmed African Americans. We are defending the rights of protesters. We are standing up for people experiencing discrimination. I think that right now our country is at a crossroads, right? I mean, before the pandemic, we were dealing with intense levels of voter suppression. We were dealing with an administration that has been incredibly hostile on every front when it comes to civil rights. We're dealing with a pandemic that is having a disproportionate and heavy impact on African Americans and people of color. We're dealing with the economic fallout, which our communities are experiencing at severe levels. And then you pile on top of that this police violence crisis that we're in. And, you know, there's just a lot of trauma out there. But I also see a lot of room for hope and opportunity. And so that's the work that my organization is doing right now, trying to figure out how we can stand shoulder to shoulder with people who are protesting and marching in the streets. How can we support the work of advocates? And how can we make sure that as civil rights lawyers, we are supporting the fight for equal justice under law? I know that Congresswoman Bass was just with us, and incredibly grateful for her leadership. I am incredibly thankful for her focus on using these last several weeks, thinking about the events that have transpired in our country, to really push Congress to do its part and heed the call. And they did that last night with the passage of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. And I was very proud to stand with her for a press conference at Capitol yesterday, urging Congress to move swiftly with this task. But as she notes, the hard work lies ahead. We've got to really push the Senate to do its job and play its part and pass this bill, a bill that's got teeth, and a bill that's really laying out an A to Z strategy for figuring out how we can overhaul policing in our country. My organization right now is busy fighting voter suppression to make sure people have voice. We are fighting and supporting policing reform. We are fighting and standing up for protesters. We filed suit a few weeks ago on behalf of the Black Lives Matter movement here in DC as a result of the Lafayette Square assault. Many of you saw this assault, which happened in the shadow of the White House. Peaceful demonstrators standing outside the historic St. John's Church, and they were met with violence at the hands of our Attorney General, Barr, at the hands of Trump, who ordered federal law enforcement officers to wage war on those demonstrators in unprovoked fashion. Our clients include a 9-year-old kid who was out with his stepmother, a veteran, religious leaders. So just to bring it all back, right, I started by talking about kind of the 60s and the events that gave rise, to the Lawyers Committee, Bloody Sunday, right? And here we are dealing with bloody Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, every day of the week, but it's not local and state officials that we're dealing with. We're dealing with the problem at the highest levels of our government. So we have a lot of work to do, but we are proud to stand in solidarity with all of the great organizations from California to every stretch across our country that are committed committed to making sure that we not waste this moment and that we use this moment to really push justice forward in a way that we've not seen in our generation.
All right, Kristen, thank you so much. And in fact, you answered my a question I was going to ask you about legislation. So you obviously feel that it's very important, and we're glad to note that you were there with the Congresswoman in that press opportunity on the Hill there. So you talked about national response. We're going to bring it back local for a minute here. We're going to talk about a woman who was appointed by Mayor Eric Garcetti recently. In fact, she is the first executive director of the newly established Los Angeles Department of Civil and Human Rights. And I'm talking about Attorney Capri Maddox. I want to say a friend probably to most everyone here. Capri, I want to ask you, aside from policing issues, what racial injustice issues do you think we need to address immediately in our communities?
Thank you so much, Pat. I'm so excited to be on the panel with you all. So many great leaders. I wanted to say first, I appreciate being appointed by the mayor in February of 2020. At that point of 2020, we didn't have COVID and we didn't have the uprising that we had after the Floyd incident. And even then, for us to think about in 2020, for us to need a newly formed department on civil and human rights is just plain ridiculous. But we definitely needed to address the issues that are at hand. I appreciate being appointed, but my first role is being a mother and a wife. And that means I'm in the house with 2 African-American men. My son is 13 years old. And he's 5'5", and I watch how people look at him and perceive him. So I do know that the policing issue is definitely something that we have to address. But I think that we have people that have their foots on our necks in other ways other than just police brutality. We're talking about lending practices, redlining, the incidents that are happening in our schools where an African-American girl is 3 times more likely to be suspended than her Caucasian counterparts. When we deal with any issues related to commerce, education, employment, and housing, it leads to a lot of issues that actually perpetuate more contact with police. And we need to address those issues as well. The other thing too is we need to not miss this moment, Pat. And Mayor Garcetti that appointed me actually said this many times, we need to make the moment, not miss it. And more so than anyone, we need to make sure we don't miss it because my skin color speaks before I do. And our skin color is not a trend. So I appreciate Councilwoman, Council President Nury Martinez and the City Council for investing resources so we can do what we need to do in this department. And in addition to bringing cases against people that violate on discriminatory practices, we are going to be able to move forward on upward mobility programming for our residents, particularly those that are in underserved communities.
All right, well, we look forward to what you're going to be doing, Capri, and your office, and of course, the outreach I'm sure that you're going to be making to probably everybody on this panel, and hopefully we will see something in the coming months. I'm just going to throw that out there, right, and affirm it. Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you so much, Capri.
Thank you so much, Matt. Appreciate you.
Another gentleman who is very familiar to us, and when I read some of the things that he's done, then you'll know why I say this. His name is Carl Douglas. He is an attorney specializing in police misconduct cases and president at Douglas Hicks Law, a professional corporation. He's the former managing attorney at the law offices of Johnny L. Cochran Jr. You probably best remember Carl for his work on the O.J. Simpson trial. He was the key, coordinator of Simpson's criminal defense. And I think while I was talking, you may have seen some video of protests and clashes with police that have been happening in the city of Los Angeles. Carl, welcome. And I mentioned the O.J. Simpson case because you were on for what, almost a year, it seems like. all over the country and the world, were broadcast all over. So that's where people recognize you. But if I recall, even before 1994, you were involved with talking about issues dealing with police. Were you not? Issues of excessive force that may not have got the attention that it did in the 90s.
Yes, Pat. And first, I want to thank Faye Washington and Cynthia Hurd and the entire YWCA family for inviting me here today and convening this fabulous panel. Pat, as you know, I have been practicing in this space for almost 40 years, 12 years working in Johnny Cochran's office. And one thing that I want to make sure your listeners understand is police brutality has not gotten worse, Pat. It's just gotten televised. I'm old school. And yes. I remember Gil Scott-Heron said that the revolution would not be televised. Well, this is the cultural revolution that he envisioned. And this revolution is live. I think it's important, Pat, for your listeners to understand that there were as many police deaths in March and April of 2020 as there were in March and April of 2019. Now, that might not sound like a big deal until you realize that in March and April of 2020, we've been shut down because of the virus. When you think about 2014, Pat, that was the year of Ferguson, hands up, don't shoot. That was the year of Eric Garner, I can't breathe. But more people were killed by police in 2019, last year, than in 2014, the year of Ferguson. So that's important for your listeners to understand. There were only 27 days in 2019 when the police did not kill one person, at least nationwide. And Pat, when you think about it, if you think, what percentage of arrests nationwide are for violent crimes? Is it a third? Is it 25%? Pat, the answer is only 5% of all arrests nationwide are for violent crimes. I didn't believe that until I looked it up myself to make sure it was true. Indeed, cops arrest more people for the possession of weed than for a violent crime in America. So I think something is wrong. We talk about police reform and what can we do? We hear a lot about reimagining police practices. I suggest we have to transform from a warrior mentality of us versus them to a guardian mentality. Pat, police officers are trained killers. They are not mental health experts. So they should not be sent out on all of these cases where people are calling for help because they need a mental health expert. And that is one way we can reimagine police practices. We can transform some of the monies that are used and transform into mental health services or homelessness, because police officers should not be sent to break up a homeless camp, but social service instead.
Or get someone who is asleep in their car.
Exactly. We have to reimagine, Pat. There are other things that we can do. For example, we can ban the chokehold. There are only 28 out of the 100 largest cities in the United States ban the chokehold. Only 28. We can recruit more women as cops. Pat, I dare say, if there had been a woman there in Minneapolis, George Floyd would still be alive today. So there are things that we can do. Your listeners, though, Pat, we can all walk and chew gum at the same time. We can protest and we can vote. We can protest and we can respond to jury summonses when they come, because that is so very important. Pat, let me tell you, I've been trying cases for 40 years. And when a cop lawyer, or even a district attorney, or even a city attorney, I dare say, Capri Maddox, sees a Black person walking into the courtroom, they treat that dude like he has the virus. Get out of here, run away. And why? Because on a jury, Black and brown people have power to save a life. On a jury, Black and brown people have power to make a difference. On a jury, Black and brown people have the power to stop injustice. So if I can offer any measure of advice to your listeners, please, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can protest and vote. We can protest and serve on juries. I'm hopeful for a better tomorrow.
Wow, thank you so much, Carl. And he gave us some specific examples of what you think needs to happen in terms of reformation in Los Angeles and really around the country. Thank you so much for your observances, Carl, and speaking truth. Now we're going to bring Justin Sanders on to our listeners and our viewers here for the town hall. He is co-managing partner of Sanders LLP. Justin Sanders is a trial attorney and the managing partner of Sanders Roberts LLP. That's one of California's largest minority-owned law firms. He has won several multi-million-dollar verdicts and settlements in a variety of misconduct cases. Welcome, Justin. And my question to you, has diversity and inclusion had any impact on social justice and the judicial system throughout America based on your experience?
Thank you, Pat, and thank you for having me today, and thank you to the YWCA for this excellent opportunity, and hi to all my friends on the panel. You know, Pat, to answer your question, I think the short answer is yes. There have obviously been a number of important changes in this society that diversity and inclusion have brought about. But the major point is that those changes haven't gone far enough. You know, I have been practicing law for 20 years now, and when I started practicing, the number of minority and women attorneys was extremely low. It was very low in large law firms. It was very low in public agencies. And in that time, we've seen increases. Now, 20 years in, when I meet with clients, companies, people in decision-making authorities in major American institutions, I'm not surprised any longer if that person is a person of color or a woman. But at the same time, when I go to court, there's times when I look around and the courtroom is packed with attorneys and there might be one woman in there. And so it's still shocking to me. So, you know, but I think what we've seen in the last couple of months with the protests following the death of George Floyd is what I have noticed to be distinct from any other movement that I've ever seen in my life is that the leading companies in the United States are actually taking notice and they're siding with the protests in some way or another. It might not be fully, but these companies are now understanding that they can't just sit on the sidelines anymore. This is a new country. We're not going back to where we were before these protests. And a lot of that is because of diversity and inclusion. People have made great changes. People in decision-making positions now are sometimes or more often people of color or women. So, you know, I'm happy about that, but we still have to recognize that all of those changes that we achieved, we had to fight very, very hard for, very hard, and nothing was given to us. And so we have to remember as we go forward that everything we want to achieve, everything we want our community to be, everything we want our country to be, is going to be fought for. And we're all going to have to stick our necks out. We're all going to have to work hard. We're going to have to keep believing. We're going to have to put small differences aside and just keep pressing forward, because we've made up a lot of ground. Now, when it comes to the judicial system, what I see is kind of fits and starts. We make progress. For example, President Obama appointed a lot of great judges. We have a new administration. The judges are different. So sometimes you see progress, and then you can see that progress backslide. And that's why it's so important to keep on going. But what the work that I do and the work that many of the attorneys on the panel do has been helped and has been aided, and we've been able to succeed at what we've been able to accomplish because of that diversity and inclusion. So we have to just keep understanding that it's our duty and our role to keep pushing this ball forward.
Okay, Justin, I see a familiar theme going through this entire panel, and that speaks to, of course, the work that you do, Faye. They're talking about women. If we had more women police officers, if we had more women making decisions, I'm all for that, just have to say. Okay, now we did have some video that I thought we would see as I was introducing Carl, but we want to show that to you now. This sort of just sets the moment of and the mood of what we have seen over the last several weeks. So we want to take a quick look at that in terms of how people are expressing themselves and how they were dealing with police officers. And these are firsthand accounts.
Changes may be coming to LAPD. The city council is now considering a motion that could replace police officers with crisis intervention teams for nonviolent calls. It's a plan that is getting support from activists tonight. KIC9's Tom Waite has more.
In the future, a call to 911 could look very different. Instead of an officer being sent to you, it could be something more like a crisis counselor. In the wake of arrests made during some of the unrest in the past couple of weeks, the LAPD has faced some harsh criticism. Today, the LA City Council introduced a motion that could fundamentally change policing in the city. Council members say unarmed crisis teams could replace police when responding to nonviolent calls. Councilman Bob Blumenfield explains how the concept could work.
When you call 911, if you're calling about a nonviolent, non-criminal matter, you'll get diverted in the future to an interventionist who will be more trained to deal with that. But if you're calling, if somebody is robbing your store or your house, that is when you would use a traditional police officer.
You're gonna get paid. You may remember this video from 2015. LAPD officers shot and killed Charlie Africa Kune, a mentally ill homeless man on Skid Row. A jury awarded his family $2 million, ruling the officers used excessive force instead of de-escalating the situation.
Police, they don't want to be doing social work.
The motion in front of council right now has the support of leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement. Professor Melina Abdullah.
If it's what it appears to be, it's absolutely a step in the right direction. And it also indicates that they were willing to listen to the voices of the people who said that public safety and policing are not synonymous, and especially for Black folks, Black Angelinos.
The LA Police Protective League says they are open to changes, but they also say morale right now among the rank and file has taken a huge hit.
The morale is definitely tanked. We feel like most city leaders have turned their backs on the law enforcement, but this is definitely the worst that I have seen in 23 years, and it's very disheartening.
Before this can become a reality, there are major logistical hurdles to get over. One example is coordinating between the LAPD and the county health department. I'm Tom Waite, KCAL 9 News.
Those protests had everyone involved, everyone from all different walks of life, ages, genders, you name it, all different races of people. We want to bring in someone here who can speak to the LGBTQ community, Terra Russell-Slavin. She is the Director of Policy and Community Building at the Los Angeles LGBTQ Center. She works to advance their rights in accordance with the center's mission to build a world where LGBTQ people thrive as healthy, equal, and complete members of society. Welcome, Terra. My question to you is, the struggle against oppression is inseparable from the LGBTQ rights movement, the movement for Black civil rights, and the LGBTQ movement, the Pride movement. have always exhibited a certain level of intersectionality. What are your thoughts about that?
Thank you, Pat, for the question. And I'd also like to thank the YWCA for hosting today's town hall and for gathering such brilliant panelists speaking to this pertinent issues of this moment. We are in the midst of June, which is Pride Month and the 51st anniversary of Stonewall. And it's critical to remember that whether it was Stonewall in New York City or Cooper's Donuts that happened nearly a decade earlier in downtown Los Angeles, Black and POC LGBTQ leaders, and specifically trans leaders, have been at the forefront of the battle for LGBT equality. And that many people exist at the intersections of these two communities. And when I think about the events of just the last month, I think there are clear illustrations of progress and very stark examples of just how much work needs to be done. In particular, I think about the fact that in the last 2 weeks, we've learned about the death of 2 more Black trans women, Dominique Remy Fells and Raya Milton. And in just this last few days, we've learned of 2 more trans women who have been murdered. And that speaks to the epidemic of violence that is happening. At almost the simultaneous time, 2 weeks ago today, the Trump administration, through the Department of Health and Human Services, published a final rule that rolls back non-discrimination protections that targets the trans community, targets LGBTQ families, targets limited English proficient speakers, and it attacks reproductive justice. And we're a party in a lawsuit that's challenging that rule right now. But I think what's critical about this is that rule was announced in the middle of a health pandemic, right? And goes to sort of the cruel and inhuman nature of who is leading this federal government and the way in which they continue to attack all of us, right? I also think it's important to acknowledge the victories. And one of the most significant is that the Supreme Court a week and a half ago held that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that sex-based protections under that act for the first time include sexual orientation and gender identity. And we are optimistic that this ruling will help lay the groundwork for expanding LGBT protections across the country. Most people may not even be aware of the fact that prior to this ruling a week and a half ago, it was still legal in more than half of the states in this country to literally fire someone because of how they identified or who they were if they were a member of the LGBT community. But I also think, and I think it's also important to acknowledge when you go back to the prompt of the question, right, that protections is coming under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which has been so central to, the expansion and the fight that Black Americans have had in this country. And it sets, and that it's been this sort of preeminent law that sets the baseline for what is legal equality and what is accepted. But I think there's a really big difference, right, between legal equality and lived equality. And we know that just on a base level, legal equality still doesn't exist for many LGBTQ people, but that gap is particularly the greatest when we're talking about lived equality and talking for LGBTQ community members who come from communities of color. As we're the largest, provider of LGBT social services in the country, we have more than 42,000 clients who visit our sites every month. We provide healthcare. We provide services for homeless youth. We provide services for LGBTQ seniors. And when you look at the social services aspect of this work, what is very clear very quickly is the people who are most at risk, whether it's for contracting HIV, whether it's for experiencing hate violence, the homeless youth we serve, that those are disproportionately Black members of the LGBT community. So all of this to say that at this critical moment, an outcry for justice for Black lives, that this is an important reminder that pride and the work of LGBTQ liberation is more than a celebration, right? It's about pushing and it's about stepping up and it's about fighting for change. And we have to step into that change. And I just really greatly appreciate everyone who's here and the work that has laid this foundation. And, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be here and look forward to continuing this fight.
Terra, thank you. And I may add, if people need an example of just how powerful and involved your movement is, I believe, if I'm not misstating, there were tens of thousands of people in Hollywood that marched in solidarity.
Yeah, more than 30,000 at the All Black Lives Matter movement.
Volumes. All right, thank you, Terra. Now, Jorja. Hi, Jorja. Jorja's been so patient. Jorja Leap is director of the UCLA Social Justice Research Partnership. So, Jorja, the question for you is, how can research best be conducted so that it no longer exploits Black, Indigenous, and people of color and fails to portray their needs and strengths?
I know this is the part that everybody's been waiting for, research, okay? And I want to
dialogue to the action.
It is. I want to thank the YWCA for inviting me with such an incredible panel of people. I feel honored to be with you, truly. Karen Bass said something that is critical to what I want to share today. She said there's all this call to study the problem, and we can't do that. And I am sitting here before you as a researcher saying what we need is a moratorium on research. We need to stop it. And it's not going to cost me my job at UCLA because I fund myself. UCLA does not pay me. So I'm the crazy aunt they kind of keep in the university. We don't need more research right now. We absolutely, in fact, I'm not going to say defund research, but I think we need to pause research. I myself have been a part of reports on LA County DCFS, LA County Probation, the LAPD, the LA Sheriff's Department, the State of California Mental Health, LAUSD. There is a stack of reports, a stack of recommendations. They're all on the shelf. We need to stop research until people look at the recommendations. And just like we need to stop task forces, we need action. And then after the action is when we need the research. Enough studying. Moratorium on any research on public agencies. They need to change. And then we can study what they have changed. But we've also got to study it in a completely different way. Too many people have made their careers on the backs of the community. There are researchers who love to go into the community and mine the data, and that's exactly the terminology they use. It is exploitation, pure and simple. And along with all the change we're calling for, I'm calling for a rethinking of research and how it's done. And trust me, it begins with me and even how I conduct research and how my team conducts research. And we are constantly trying to not only represent the community, research must partner with the community. That doesn't mean including them. It means that they are equal. It means that they are asked from the beginning, are these the kinds of questions we should be asking? No, they're not. Let's change them. It's all through the research process. The community must partner. And here's the most radical idea of all. The community must be paid. For decades, we have gone into communities. We have used community members as our information sources, and we give them a Jamba Juice card. And I'm not exaggerating, or a Starbucks card. And I have had to look at colleagues and say, you know, there's not a Jamba Juice within 20 miles of where a resident is currently living. Okay? Stop it. It has to end. The other thing is, whenever someone profits from a community, the community should share in those profits. And let me tell you, so far I've written 2 books. Every penny of those 2 books, one has been about Homeboy Industries, one has been about Project Fatherhood in Jordan, Down, and Watts. The money goes to those organizations, not to me. We have to stop. We have to change research radically. And the other thing is, we have to be able to speak truth to power. It's becoming a cliche, but too often researchers are in the hands of the people who fund them. I recently completed a study on the LAPD Community Safety Partnership. It had some very positive outcomes about law enforcement and community partnering. Just as Mr. Douglas said, Connie Rice created this to go from warrior policing to guardian policing. But let me tell you, that study was not a love letter to the LAPD. We came up with 45 recommendations, and not a single one of them said, "You're doing a good job, attaboy or attagirl." And that study was taken and weaponized to call for a larger LAPD budget. As a researcher, I was furious. And I can tell you another lesson learned. And I've been at this 40 years, still learning, and hopefully always will. We do not serve the funders. We do not serve the government agencies. We serve the community. And it's time we need to remember that. It's time we need to stop exploiting. It's time to start paying. And also, it's time to take a pause, because this is not the time for research until new structures are put into place that we can then assess.
Jorja, wow. Jorja Lee, yes, applause for you. I mean, that is some serious truth telling that you just gave us.
I mean
right there. I can tell that you mean it. And I know there is truth in what you're saying. You've done the research. Well, the research has been done. Utilize it and bring forth action, because I guess you can research till the end of time, right?
Oh, come on. And you know, we all sit around and talk to each other, and we don't move the needle 1 point.
Right.
Also, I will tell you, stop with the academic writing. I have a devotion to writing in English that doesn't need to be translated. Okay?
I'm laughing, but again, you have really dropped some gems. Thank you so much, Jorja Lee. Now, given the deep systemic racism interwoven in American society, where do we start the change? We want to hear from some of our YWCA panelists who are actually on the forefront. They're out there on the front lines as well, and see what they have to say. Let's start with Angeline Chen. She's the board president of the YWCA in Pasadena. So, Angeline, what are your thoughts about that?
Thank you, Pat, for having such a great voice. And thank you, YWCA Greater Los Angeles, for putting on this important event. I'm humbled to be with such esteemed leaders in the community. I can think of a couple of ways of starting the change. One is, do not let the mainstream public forget that racism exists. Once the issue stops getting into their social media feed, people will forget. We can't let that happen. I was here in '92 during the LA riots. I knew you were too, Pat. We cannot let another close to 30 years go by and very little has changed. The YWCA Pasadena used to have community forums called Talking the Talk, where we discussed issues about racial profiling, police brutality, Islamophobia, immigration, LGBTQ issues. This question reminded me an action item that we need to bring this back. An event that we are pretty well known for is our YWCA Pasadena's Women for Racial Justice Breakfast, where we award women who have been active in combating racial justice. You see the theme of women today, right? This year will be our 18th year, 18th. For 17 years, we've had over 350 people show up in the early morning for our breakfast. We've actually awarded Dr. Melina Abdullah from Black Lives Matter, who spoke earlier in the past. This year, our event will be at 9 a.m. virtual on October 19th. Our theme is Strong Foundation, Strong Future. We want to go back to our roots, regroup, reactivate, rebuild our base. Because if we have a strong foundation, a strong core, we can be a great role model for our youth and our future leaders. Some of the honorees we have this year include Margaret Leung-Cheka, who happens to be on the YWCA Greater LA board, Johari Dewitt-Rogers, Denise Jones, some women who have started this breakfast. What I'm most proud of about the YWCA Pasadena is that we never let the topic of racism go away. We never try to change the title of our event to make it more mainstream. You are coming because you want to fight racism. You want to help eliminate racism. If in any way this topic of eliminating racism is no longer the cool thing to talk about, we at the YWCA Pasadena will still be holding this event to remind people. Second, we need to continue, and I know we're doing this, but we need to make sure we continue to communicate amongst different communities, including communities of color, and also reach beyond our comfort zone and mobilize with white people who are open to learning and mobilizing with us. Many of our issues overlap with racism as a component. And this is not just a race issue. This is an issue about humanity. We are fighting to save our humanity. There are so many people who have not traditionally been involved in the race discussion, who want to understand and who want to help. And they're shocked that this George Floyd incident happened. And we're telling them, we've been trying to tell you forever that this has been happening. It's just didn't just happen now. I am an immigration attorney, and I volunteer to help reunite families separated at the border. And I see many similarities between the issue of immigration and police brutality. The Department of Homeland Security has been committing acts of genocide by taking babies away from their moms. They still are. When you have law enforcement and the racist prison system, they've been separating Black and brown families in the US forever. Different agencies, similar actions. When I saw tear gas used against peaceful protesters, which is a chemical warfare agent, it triggered a memory from November 2018 when CBP shot tear gas to peaceful migrants and families in Tijuana over the wall. When I saw law enforcement poking holes in water bottles and destroying food that was there for protesters, during the demonstrations, it triggered a memory of watching videos of Customs and Border Patrol officers poking holes in water jugs that were there for migrants crossing through the desert to survive, laughing and making racist remarks. When I saw police officers arresting reporters and healthcare professionals during these demonstrations, it triggered a memory of our federal government targeting reporters, health professionals, religious leaders who have helped asylum seekers and placed them on an Interpol watch list. That's still there. Different agencies, similar actions. I can go on and on. Now, what this event is today, it is a perfect example of bridging communities and bringing all of us together. We are standing in solidarity. I'm so grateful for this event, and we definitely need to do more of this. Don't let the public forget. Let's save our humanity. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Angeline. You brought back so much when you talked about tear gas. We saw quite a few incidents of that, and I think one of our own people, maybe a couple, were directly involved. I want to bring on Tanis Crowley. She is the YWCA Executive Director of Silicon Valley. So Tanis, welcome to the conversation, and thank you for the work that you do as well.
Thank you, Pat. It's great to be here. Jorja was challenging us to rethink research, and I'd like for us to rethink charity, because charitable organizations are not immune to white supremacy culture. The very notion of a charitable sector needs examination. Charity is about helping people who need assistance. But in what ways is this system inherently racist? Who gets to decide what gets done and how? Who decides what's funded? A handful of rich philanthropists? Is this really just organized white saviorism? You gotta ask these questions. Because what is clear is that charitable service without social justice is no service at all. And that's why our YWCA here at Silicon Valley and also San Francisco and Marin, our YWCA has a triad approach: deliver service, issue education, and advocate for change. Change lives, change minds, change the rules. Our approach strives to be rooted in a justice approach, yet our services still exist within that charitable paradigm. The work to dismantle racism calls us all into account. And our work is unfinished. We have a long way to go, and this moment is calling upon us to do more. So what will we do about this? At our YWCA, our emerging anti-racist work is three-pronged. Internal capacity building. This is about training and learning and continuing dialogue, holding space for courageous conversations around race equity. It also means internal strategic action, race equity work across all agency operations, and third, external facing programming. And one example of a game-changing program toward working toward equity and illuminating systemic injustice is a program we incubated called Curated Pathways to Innovation. You know, here in Silicon Valley, the tech workforce and everywhere, that workforce remains stubbornly white and male, and access to STEM careers is one of the greatest opportunities to advance economic justice in the 21st century. And the good news is there's lots of programs out there trying to solve this, but the bad news is we aren't necessarily having an impact, and not all of those interventions are centered on a racial or gender justice lens. Systemic racism is a root cause here. There are insufficient teachers, insufficient resources for public schools, not enough mentors. More interventions do not mean more impact, and we don't necessarily need yet a new program to fix the leaky tech pipeline. We need a whole new system to fix the plumbing. In fact, we need an entire repipe. Fortunately, we can work toward that kind of big, bold change by actually leveraging technology to do that. That's where YWCA's Curated Pathways to Innovation comes in. Our personalized learning application actually uses machine learning technology to solve this challenge. And it is centered on the voice and choice of young people of color. You know, at the turn of the century, the 1900s, YWCAs across the country built buildings to provide social programs, charitable programs. In the 21st century, our YWCA is building software to solve the equity gap in STEM, because we are on a mission, and that means leveraging 21st century tools to advance racial and gender justice. So to sum, number one, the full resources of all our institutions must be anti-racist. Number two, we need to innovate. We need to leverage these tools to advance justice. We need to learn, unlearn, take action, repeat, and I am humbly on this journey with my YWCA, and we are all in.
Well, Tanis, thank you. And I'm just going to pick up on what you said in terms of talking about charitable and nonprofit organizations. I'm going to do a commercial because it's very important. We are asking everyone out there listening to please donate to the YWCA by texting YWCA GLA 2020 to 1-855-663-9922. And that information is also on our website. This has been an amazing panel, and we're not done yet. We have some questions and answers that we want to get to, but first, I want to give it back to our chairman, Ms. Faye Washington.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you to everyone who is here today. My heart is so full. It is a joy to imagine something and then see it happen, and it happened just like the script you gave everybody. And for that, I'm so grateful. Jorja, you have just touched on exactly what I thought was necessary. Cut the research. I was researching 45 years ago. I'm still researching today, and we know what we need to be done. We've just got to stand boldly and do it. And that's what today is about. It's about the moral moment that we're in. I heard someone say that, and it's genuine. This is our moment. It's our moment in history, and if we don't seize this moment, many of us won't be around for the second go around. We've got to act quickly. And that's why this conversation was necessary this day, this time. It was a bold action, but you all came to the party, so don't complain. I thank each of you. I thank Pat, you're just splendid, beyond belief. I thank the YWCA, my sisters who are here and some who are virtually here. I believe our Pacific region closed down its board meeting today so that they all can participate. I'm told that we have over 1,500 persons engaged in a virtual space, listening to these wonderful thoughts and ideas. The panel, you have gone well beyond. So therefore, know that you're not out of my reach, because there is an after party to all of this. And all of you are invited to the after party. Because you see, at the end of the day, it's about change. I know about the change. I've been working in this community of LA for over 45 years. We feel the pain of the community. We see the pain in the eyes of those in our programs, and we know that we can do better, but we can't do it alone. And you have so many barriers that are seemingly just tossed in your way, be it police reform, be it lack of mental health facilities, be it lack of hospitals, be it lack of economics, jobs. We talk about equity. Equity is straight up economics. If I got the money, I have the equity because I can buy what I need. You don't have the economics, you don't have the wherewithal to get that. How do you live in equity? We always are asking for a handout. This time we're going to take the hands, we're going to cut them off, we're going to create our own avenues and make it happen. We feel the pain, and we know now is the time to really just get the knee off of the community's neck. We know what it feels like. We are suffocating in the community. That's why I'm here. And that's why I'm so full of just pure joy that everyone has lended your support. This is a new day. We're out of the nest, however. We're taking risk at the YWCA because we stand for equality. It's about the elimination of racism and the empowerment of all. What are we going to do now? It's our intent to take our new partners that are now joined in this dialogue. We're going to deputize you all, and we're going on the field. We're going to do these community engagements. We're going to listen to the community. I don't know that we will pay them or not, but we're going to listen. We will act, and we will learn. We will advocate because change is imminent. It is ours, and let's take it. So I think there's some questions and answers that need to be handled. Pat, I'm going to turn it back over to you. But the hope and optimism is here. And thank you so much for participating.
And we can certainly feel it, Faye. Thank you so much for that. People have sent in questions, and one in particular was, how can everyday folk in the community get involved? How can people in marginalized communities get involved to make change? I mean, even besides going out to vote, what can they do? And I'm going to just open that to whoever wants to answer it first.
Well, they can, as a first step, consider the dialogue process. That is, let's look at the issues impacting us and begin to have a conversation with people who care about those issues. And come to with your self-care first, or you move to social action. So that is one way that people can be involved.
All right. Tanis, did you want to say something? You want to respond?
Pat, I'll answer that. I think in addition to what Avis Ridley Thomas said, I think that the most important thing in terms of action is to remember that getting outside and letting your presence be felt is the most important thing. You know, it's great to advocate online, you know, in your Facebook feed. It's great to do social media and push information, but nothing moves the United States and creates change more than getting outside of your home and protesting, walking, doing whatever it takes to let your presence be known. I think sometimes we can get a little complacent thinking that maybe social media is all we can do. But if you really want to make change, you have to get outside and let them see your faces. You know, we can do it during the pandemic. We have to obviously be safe. But I think that's really what changes things here in the U.S.
I just want to reinforce what Carl Douglas said. I love that you said we can walk and chew gum. We need to be physically present, just as you said, Justin. We need to be on juries. We need to answer. everyone needs to answer those jury summons, and voting, voting, voting. I can't tell you how many people in communities of color, Black communities, Indigenous communities say to me, oh, my vote doesn't matter. Over and over I hear this. That must change forever.
You know, picking up on what Justin said, that's the old grassroots movement, is it not? I mean, that's what used to happen. People would get outside and possibly go door to door. Politicians who want the votes had to get out and shake hands. And I love that you were really speaking maybe to young people, because the question is, how can young people engage in creating change? How can they become a part of the movement besides the social media?
I wanted to mention something. Oh, thank you. I want to mention something as well. You know, I feel that people are watching the news and there's so many issues and they're getting really overwhelmed. You know, they're tired of all this injustice. And I see that. We see that. Focus on the small things that you could do. Focus on your strength. Don't try to do everything, because nobody can. I'm sure every one of the panelists, we're all dealing with the same thing. Can we do it all? We can't do it all. We have to do the best that we can. And so for people out there, think about the small things that they can help with. If they could donate a little bit, if they're, more wealthy, they could donate more. They could plan a fundraiser. They can mobilize people. They can make phone calls. And social media can be very powerful. And, they could be more active on social media, but really think about what your strength is and what you can do, and every little thing will matter.
Okay. Carl, looks like you want to say something.
One thing that I think is very important is the diversity of the protests, and that people are getting out is making a real difference. I tell my friends all the time, he who does not learn from his history is doomed to repeat it. And I go back to the 60s, and Bull Connor was pulling the dogs and the fire hoses and beating Black people incessantly. And then freedom riders came down from New York and New Jersey, and the images of white Americans also having hoses turned on them and having the dogs on them shocked the conscience of America. And that led to the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 65 going into effect. I tell people to remember Martin Gugino, Gugino. He's the old guy in Buffalo who was knocked down by stormtrooper-looking officers who walked over his body, somewhat Allen Iverson-like, Justin would understand, and continued marching. That is the image, because that could be anybody's papa. That could be anybody's father. That could be the nice man that lives down the street. And when you have that kind of connection, I tell you, that is what's going to stimulate real change. Ben & Jerry's has a great corporate statement. NASCAR is taking care of Confederate flags. And I'm a NASCAR fan. I'm a football fan, and I heard Roger Goodell say Black Lives Matter. I'm hopeful, but it's going to take all of us to continue to raise our voices for the people to really take notice and to affect change.
Okay, I do have a question that real quick. What can we do to educate our children on how to react to police violence? How do we build trust? Capri, you want to take that one?
Yes. So this is an issue that we have to deal with. Again, I said I am the mother of a 13-year-old boy, and I'm a former criminal prosecutor. So my son actually spent a lot of time in police stations as a kid, crawling around. And oftentimes he was picked up by police officers. Many pictures of him being held by police officers. And now, is seeing what he sees pretty much since he's been about 9 years old. He's seeing image after image after image of Black men being mistreated in certain circumstances. And now I would have never thought, based on his childhood experiences, that he would have fear from the police, and he actually does. And what I do to explain to him is just to let him know that there are police officers that are here to serve, and they're ready to make a difference. However, we need to be mindful of the fact that we do have rogue police officers that are abusing people's rights. In addition, I've also had the talk with him. I mean, not only if he's stopped by the police, how he reacts, but even now the problem is we have a lot of people who call themselves vigilantes, but they are mobs of people that are doing disrespectful things to Black people and many people of color. I've even had to tell my son, Pat, if you're walking into our house and someone stops you and says you do not live here, do not grab your phone, do not grab your house key, because they may be armed and kill you. So you need to sit down and let them know I have the key. If we do go inside, you'll see pictures of me right on the front table. And so there are issues, and I have to protect my son from not only the police, but just mistreatment because of the color of his skin everywhere we go. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Capri. Some of our most impacted communities are communities of color. So I'm going to ask this question, and Faye or Justin or Terra, if you want to jump in on this one. This has to do with South LA. How can people get involved in terms of being involved in the equitability of the budget, of the city budget that is spent, dollars for their communities? What can they do? What can be done?
Well, I'll go first. Thank you, Faye. I think, again, it ties back to making your presence known. And, I've worked in government for a long time prior to my law practice, and even at the beginning. And what I see is that government reacts to generally the loudest and most persistent base. And so, when you are living in South LA and you grew up in South LA and that's your community, you need to advocate for South LA on a local level. Okay, you need to get involved on your local neighborhood boards. You need to know your city council person. One thing I like to say is it's for me on a day-to-day basis. My city council person is sometimes more important than a distant federal official. I can call the city council office and advocate for even minor things. These people have to know your name, and it's not going to happen in one day. It's going to take sustained effort, and you need to organize with other people. But one of the things that I would say is don't ever look at yourself or your community that you're in and feel that you can't do it. That's the most important thing. You have to believe that you are just as good as anyone else, that you are just as capable as anyone else. And if you have that fundamental belief right there, then you can do things that you would probably not even imagine.
We talk about this. Oh, go ahead, Faye. I'm sorry.
I just want to add to what Justin was saying. I have the benefit of realizing a whole lot of different ways to bake a cake, so to speak. And you ask the question, how do we get the young folks involved? Many moons ago, there used to be something called community meetings in the community, and they were sponsored by the council member of that community. Tell you one of the things that creates the biggest barrier from having your voice heard from the community. Going downtown to City Hall to budget hearings is quite intimidating. And many are not going to do that. It's at a time at which you're at work or at school. And if we began to speak to the community, make life convenient for the community, there are some council members that still do it, but it has evolved to where it's decisions made on top and pushed down. We can garner much more attention from a nonprofit community organized standpoint, from Avis's Days and Dialogue standpoint, the ability to convene those individuals within the community so that they know that they're making changes for themselves. It has relevance.
I want to throw a question out, and Terra and Tanis, I'm going to tag you. We have seen this particular movement and most people will say, I mean, even Dr. Melina spoke to this herself, this was a movement made up of all different kinds of people. In the white community, we have seen more whites speak up and join this particular movement, which is something rather new. And I think Angeline spoke to that too. It took a lot of time, and maybe it was the George Floyd video being shown around the country. What do you say? Do you think it's important to talk to other people in communities about anti-racism and what it means? You know, it used to be such a taboo subject. You couldn't talk about that. You shouldn't talk about it. It would be so misunderstood. Like it's a blame game, or you're trying to guilt people. Now, is there a real conversation?
I was going to say absolutely. And I think, I feel like within organizations, within nonprofit structures, we have to be very meaningfully thinking about how do we challenge white supremacy, because it exists in those spaces, and to also name and interrupt anti-Blackness. And so, you know, it does feel different, but it's been in the works. And I think this is maybe something was ignited, but there was a lot of groundwork that was already laid because of so many leaders, people on this call. And I think the expectation now is not even that if we talk about, maybe it used to be hard, the expectation is that we're having those hard conversations. And I think that's part of what's different about this moment.
And if I could jump in and just share, like, this is a message to white sisters out there. Do not be relying on Black, Indigenous people of color to enlighten you to the work you need to do. Like, dear white people, do the work. You just heard Capri talk about her work as a mom in protecting her child in being safe. Wait, did I have that conversation with my 16-year-old when he got his driver's license? No. So dear white people, have those conversations with your sisters and with your children and do the work.
And if I may, Pat?
Yes, Bob.
I'd like to add to that, because I'm a believer that Black people cannot shame white people into ending racism. We can't do it. It takes conversations with white people among other white people when there are moments of quiet reflection and a person is now comfortable in that environment and is then just politely unfurling his sheet for other white people to see. It is in those moments that my white allies have to call their white friends out and correct them, because they're not going to listen to me, and I'm not going to be able to criticize them or shame them into ending racism, I don't think.
Jorja, she's agreeing.
Yep.
You know, the other thing, and I have to say, it's another place where the university has completely failed. All universities. The faculty is not, there is tokenism. There's the one Black faculty member. There's the one faculty member of color. And we have students of color, Black students, Indigenous students, who do not see faculty who look like them, who are not hired on research projects, who are not encouraged to go on. And I have seen faculty members assume that any Black student, any Black male student, was a student athlete. So right? Okay. That's the kind of stuff to call out. It doesn't even have to be dramatic. In fact, it's rarely dramatic. We have to, as white folk, we have to be aware of those microaggressions, those everyday events, along with the big institutional blocks, and call them out. Because when my colleague assumed it was a Black athlete, I was able to say, this is a straight A student who is going to work for Brian Stevenson in the summer.
All right, simple as that. And I guess that also goes back to what Avis was talking about in her days of dialogue, those kinds of conversation. Conversations that take place with all different kinds of people from the community.
In a safe space. That's what we create through that facilitated process, so that people can feel, even though their groups may be diverse, that they have the opportunity with some ground rules to express themselves in a genuine way, authentically, and to be challenged in a way that does not shame them or put them down, but gives them the opportunity to explore some of the ideas that they may have long held, that may have been taught to them, that they are uncomfortable with, but they haven't necessarily explored before. So thank you for the shout out for Days of Dialogue in this setting of Faye, Washington, the YWCA. It is much appreciated, and we will continue that work.
And much needed.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Avis. Terra, I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about what it means to be included, especially in representing the LGBTQ community. What does inclusion look like to you?
Oh, that's a big question. I guess I will just say that I greatly appreciate it. I think that I heard from one of my colleagues recently, it's so critical, particularly someone in a white leadership position in an LGBTQ organization, that we immediately shut down notions, right? That there is, that this movement is not LGBT inclusive, that we push back against that narrative, because that is not the case, because so many of the leaders, right, are LGBTQ leaders in this Black liberation justice movement. And I think also for me, it goes to the point of reflecting on the responsibility, right? If the privilege of being allowed into this space also means the responsibility of how do I show up? How do we show up? And how do we move this work forward? By looking to Black-led leaders, to Black-led organizations, and how do we lend support a capacity to sort of shift and change policy. As someone who works in policy, that's, you know, I want to, you know, we're trying to figure out how do we have our resistance squad calling in support of efforts of defunding law enforcement and shifting resources back into social services. And you know, and these are just conversations that are past due and need to happen. And it's both external and internal work.
All right. Thank you so much, Terra. And ladies and gentlemen, kids, I'm going to give you this number again to make sure that you can help the YWCA, YWCA GLA 2020. And you can use the number 855, text YWCA GLA 2020 to 855-663-9922. I mean, if you like what you've seen here today or listened to here today, that should move you to make a move and to call that number and to help the Y and all the wonderful things and the many sometimes dangerous things that they do to actually go out in the communities and help some of these young girls, women, everyone. This is very hard and difficult work, and they're doing it. So Faye, Washington, I want to thank you again for convening this town hall. To all the panelists here, and I'm sure that I will see you on the other side, possibly be talking to you on camera pretty soon. To our listeners, to everyone, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation and so inspiring. And I thank you for joining us today. And again, Faye, thank you for inviting me. And another plug, I hope to see you tonight at 5, 6, and 11 on CBS.
You got it.
All right, have a good day. Let's work for change and be back here and talk about some of the improvements and the actions that we made. Good afternoon.
I know. Thank you.
Good afternoon.